Hey and welcome back. Next part in the How to Build a Coffee Table series. While these legs were drying up, I went ahead and prepared the top. If you want to see how I did that, stick around. Welcome back to the Woodgrafter. I'm Andy Guile, and if you're new here, our mission is to inspire, educate and support you in your journey to becoming a better woodworker. We do that through a whole series of how-to videos, project builds such as this one. We do tool tips, techniques, reviews, we look at deep dive subjects if anything of interest comes up, and all in all just get together and have a good chat. So if you're new here, consider subscribing, leave me a thumbs up and don't forget to leave a comment so we can have a conversation. Let's get going. So while these legs were clamped up and while they were drying, I used the time effectively to bring our top down to these final dimensions. In this episode I want to have a look at how I did that, and I start by sanding the surface. The first thing I want to do is to make sure I don't actually damage the tabletop as it rests on the MFT. I find that these small discs, these benchtop protectors from benchdogs.co.uk really help, and that small nylon sticker on top of each of these discs gives enough friction to stop the board sliding around during sanding. For this job I'm going to use the Festool Random Orbit sander. You could come in with a belt sander on this one, but that's a bit extreme. Because we use the dominoes, the joints are pretty well lined up, so it's more a case of flattening things and just tidying up. I'll use a variety of grits. I'll start off with 40, I'll then go to 60, 80, 120 and finally finishing off with a 180. I'll be using an oil-based finish on this top. Anything greater than 180 I find the oil tends to sit and not to penetrate the surface overall. I've got the hard pad fitted here on the sander to make sure I don't round the edges of the table off. So starting off with the 40 grit paper, starting off in the top left hand corner for no apparent reason, I just simply move back and to left to right across the tabletop. I don't push down hard, I just use the weight of the sander for this one. If you push down too hard with a random orbit sander, you'll start to leave scratch marks and whorls on your tabletop, and that doesn't really help you. So simply matter, overlapping your cuts, take the time, left, right, really focusing on this tabletop, and keep going until all those dirty marks have gone and it feels smooth under touch. Don't be tempted here to move on to the next grit too quickly. It won't save anything, it just makes more work and makes the job harder. Take your time with the heavy grit paper and that will come down reasonably quickly. After about 15 minutes or so of sanding on that 40 grit paper, I've got this pretty much where I want it to be. All the dirty marks have gone, everything's looking nice and neat and smooth. Now I just use a straight edge. I'm just sighting under the straight edge looking for any obvious highs or any obvious lows. And because of the technique that we use, overlapping the sander left and right with the hard pad on it, there aren't really any grooves or problems on this surface. But then again, I wouldn't expect there to be using that technique. If there were any problems, I'd mark the high spots and I'd still work with the 40 grit to bring the high spots down, and I'm looking for a level surface across the board. Now because I've taken my time to get that surface flat with the 40 grit paper, the next few grits are really simple. I take a pencil, in this case chalk so you can see it, and I just scribble right across the board. And I go up to the next grit of paper, next grit of paper for us being 60 grit. And what I do, I use that same technique, left to right across the board until all that chalk pattern or the pencil pattern has gone, and then I know I'm in a good place. Now what I'm doing here is I'm actually taking out the scratch marks that the previous grit made. So I'm no longer trying to flatten the board or take too much material away from the board or even clean the board up. I'm simply taking out those heavy scratch marks that the 40 grit paper made. So you just simply do this through all the grits. Keep doing this with your grit of paper until all those lines have gone. You can still see a faint outline in the bottom left hand corner on this board, so I will go over this board a couple of times. Then I'll reapply the chalk, go up to the next grit of paper, and I'll keep doing that all the way through to the 180 grit, and at that point my job's done. So this is it. This is the final pass on the 180 grit paper. And you can see the board's looking really nice and clean now as well. And trust me, if you could feel this, it's a beautiful feel, really flat, really tactile. Now you can still see there's some shadow lines of the chalk on the bottom half of the board, so I'll go over this a couple more times. But at this point I've probably been going for about 30 minutes. And what you'll find, every subsequent pass of the sander with the high grit paper gets easier and easier. And it's important that you do that, work up through the grits. Do not skip the grits of paper. If you do that, it just makes it harder for yourself. Let the sandpaper do the work, let the weight of the sander do the work, let that random orbit thing do its job, and you'll quickly come down to the board and the finish that you want. And as you can see, that's looking really nice. Pleased with that. Now with that surface all nicely sanded on the top and on the bottom, I then bring it down to its final length. Let's have a look at that. I'm going to be using the track saw to bring this down to its final width and its final length. Now although the edges have been machined and they have been jointed, they do get slightly damaged as you're moving the board around, and that edge is very weak, so there's a few chips on that I'm not happy with. So what I'm doing is lining up the track saw to the edge, about 5mm, and then just running the TS55 down the edge. And all that will do is clean the edge up and give me a very nice pristine reference edge that we can then use to work on the rest of the board. With that edge made, I now want to break the aris. The aris is that sharp edge you get when two 90-degree smooth faces come into contact with each other. Think about what we've just done, that's exactly what we've just made. Now not only is that edge very sharp and can cut your hands, it's also very weak, so it splinters easily. So just take a block plane and run down that edge 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 times at the outside, and that just breaks that joint for you, takes away the sharpness and strengthens the edge. Now if you've not got a block plane, you can do this with a very finely set smoothing plane, a number 4 plane for example, or even a 5 jack plane. Or if you've not got any planes, just lightly rub this by hand with some high grit sandpaper. Perfect. So I've turned the board round. That reference edge we cut before is now over at the back near the wall there. And all I'm doing here is lining up the rail with that back edge, the reference edge. Now I don't really care what this dimension is, but I do care that the rail ends up parallel to the back surface. And once again, all I'm looking to do here is to trim out that front edge. Take away some of those chips, some of those dings that have appeared as we've been sanding the board down. So no more than 5mm off this front edge, but as I say, it's got to be parallel to that back edge. Now once I'm happy, and once I've got this lined up, I can just once again come in with a track saw to trim that front edge down, and at that point I'm going to call that job done, and that board is good to go. Now the two edges trimmed down and everything nice and parallel, and yes I did check that with my steel rule, it's time to start to cut this to length. Now the top is a little bit too wide for my MFT, so I can't use the dog holes here to give me that guaranteed right angle I'm looking for. I could of course pull the benches out and turn the top around, but to be honest with you, I'm so confident in the cuts I've made at those edges, I don't need to do that. So I just use a square and I bring the square in to make sure that my rail is nice and square. I double check everything before I make the cut, and that's looking reasonably good, and now I can go ahead and trim the end off. I then measure my final distance, 1240mm, and make a mark, and then I can use my square and bring the rail in once again against that mark to line up the final cut that will bring this thing down to length. And there you have it, you now have a nice smooth top, sympathetic grain to the legs. This thing's really coming together. I'll see you next time.